afternoon. Welcome to Spy Chat. I'm Amanda Olkey, Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our Executive Director, Chris Costa, has Carol Rollie Flynn, President of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, as his very special guest. Rollie is a 30-year veteran of the CIA. She held senior executive positions there, including Director of CIA's Leadership Academy, Director of the Office of Foreign Intelligence Relationships, Associate Deputy Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Executive Director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, and Chief of Station in major posts in Southeast Asia and Latin America. She has extensive experience in overseas intelligence operations, security, and counterintelligence. Rollie is also, at this time, adjunct professor at Georgetown University School of Foreign Service Security Studies program, where she has co-directed the National Security Critical Issue Task Force. And Rollie is a great supporter of the Spy Museum. She serves on our advisory board, and we really appreciate her support on programs like this and other topics. Now, enough from me. Over to you, Chris Costa.
Amanda, thank you very much for the great introduction. Rollie, I got to tell you, our team is really excited about having you. Thank you for your longtime association of the Spy Museum. I know our audience won't be disappointed. So let me just dive right into some of the big national security stories that I've been tracking this past month. First and foremost, a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration published their national security strategy, which focuses, no surprise, on China, Russia, and democracy at home. It's not a crazy strategy by any means. In fact, it's very pragmatic, and I would make the point that so wasn't the last national security strategy that was published in 2017. That too was a very pragmatic strategy. It was done early in the Trump administration. We had guest Nadia Shadlow here, who really was the architect for that strategy. So both strategies are very pragmatic. What makes this particular strategy different from past strategies is it focuses on restoring damaged democracy at home. So that's a bit of a departure, and it expresses concerns for autocratic governments across the globe and its impact on the United States. And of course, it focuses on restraining Russia, which is very important in light of what's happening in the Ukraine. So again, just to put a finer point on it, I believe the national security strategy is a very, very pragmatic strategy for the current security paradigm. And I give credit to the administration for publishing it. I should note it was published later than it was supposed to be published, but that was a result, again, of Russian malign activities in the Ukraine. The administration wanted to make sure that they provided the appropriate context and the way forward. So this is clearly a blueprint for the rest of the U.S. government to follow in terms of national security strategy. And related to the Ukraine, I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the dirty bomb reporting. The idea that Ukraine is going to execute some kind of radiological device, and this reporting is coming from Russia, suggesting that Ukraine is going to use a dirty bomb. And of course, the Western intelligence organizations in particular have suggested this is clearly forecasting a false flag operation. In other words, Russia is looking for a pretext, perhaps for some kind of escalation. The fact that Western intelligence services are calling it out, the fact that the UN officials are going to go on the ground in the Ukraine and certify that Ukraine isn't building any kind of radiological device. I think that bodes well in terms of really flagging this disinformation from Russia. Next, I want to talk about some interesting reporting that came out of a British spy chief. We've heard from the head of MI6, I think this past summer, the Secret Intelligence Service from the UK. We heard from MI5 in a joint conference with Director of the FBI, Wray. Of course, MI5 is the security service for the UK. And this past week, we heard from the head of GCHQ, which is Britain's signals intelligence agency. So it is fascinating. Normally, UK is closed lips, and they don't do very many public discussions of intelligence-related matters. But in this particular case, the head of GCHQ basically said that Russia is exhausted. They have significant morale problems with their military forces, and Putin is making lots of mistakes, strategic errors in judgment, all no surprise to us, but the fact that another UK senior official went out and spoke about that intelligence, I think, is important. Of course, he also caveated his remarks by saying, and I paraphrase, that Russia is still increasingly dangerous, to be sure. The next story I want to talk about is a counterintelligence story. And this will track with the fact that we are very much focused, the United States is, on countering China and competing with China. So this past Monday, there was a Department of Justice press conference where the Attorney General laid out malign activities from China. We have talked about the threat coming from Chinese intelligence officers in the United States very directly. There were 3 cases that were revealed to the public this past Monday at that press conference. The first case was about, actually remarkable, a double agent operation, in that the FBI and the Attorney General said that a double agent, someone that the Chinese thought that they were controlling, was working for the United States. The purpose of that operation by the Chinese intelligence officers was to interfere and understand FBI prosecutorial strategies to go after a Chinese company. Now, the company wasn't named, but other reporting in open media has suggested that that company is Huawei. No surprise, a Chinese telecommunications company. We talked about Huawei all last year. So that's the first case. The second case is also no surprise to our audience, and that second case is all about Chinese intelligence officers tapping into U.S. think tanks, trying to coerce, co-opt, and recruit Americans and Chinese residents here in the United States to provide intelligence for Chinese intelligence officers. And the third case is equally alarming, and that's about Chinese intelligence officers going after Chinese residents here in the United States and coercing them and threatening them and harassing them and trying to get them to go back to China, where inevitably they will face a price with China's internal security services. So just imagine, these cases are breaking out all across the country, and this really does complement our national security strategy. So I would credit our intelligence services for the diligent work that they are doing cooperatively also with other counterintelligence services. So we've talked about that story, and just as a bit of an advertisement, I'm hoping to have the head of FBI's counterintelligence join us sometime early in 2023, maybe to provide some additional context. So the next story I want to talk about, I'll transition to counterterrorism, is another really, really important story that might have gotten missed in our media cycle. And it has to do with a French company, a cement company that was on the ground in Syria. The company's name is Lafarge. It's a global cement company. It was in northern Syria, I believe, but they were paying ISIS and essentially cooperating with ISIS so they could continue servicing and doing their worldwide cement work. And frankly, that was in violation of material support to terrorist organization, specifically ISIS. When you think back the threat that ISIS projected in France itself, it's a remarkable case. The United States has the authorities in accordance with our laws here in the United States, and the Department of Justice sued the company. They have paid a fine of $780 million for conspiring with the Islamic State militants circa 2014-13, I think. It's a remarkable story, and you can go online and read about the indictment and the details. Again, material support to ISIS. In the final story I want to talk about, and we always like on Spy Chat, at least I do, to talk about wrongful detainees. And specifically, I'll talk about Ms. Griner for a moment. The United States clearly is involved deeply, not only with trying to get Griner out of Russia, at the same time, Paul Whelan wrongfully detained, and there are many other cases that the United States government is working on. But former UN Ambassador Richardson has also privately worked on getting U.S. citizens who are wrongfully detained released from different countries in the Middle East and elsewhere. So there was an excellent interview in the New York Times in an article about Governor Richardson's and Ambassador Richardson work on hostages. And some people are critical that a private citizen is working outside the U.S. government construct, essentially the hostage enterprise. I would make the point, my opinion, that as long as those efforts are coordinated somewhat with the United States, the more focus we have on bringing home wrongful detainees, the better it is for the United States. And frankly, I think it really demonstrates the United States' resolve to bring home hostages and resolve these cases. So that's an awful lot to think about. I will finish my remarks with the book recommendation. So I have talked frequently about the importance of the 5I relationships, the intelligence relationship, the special relationship the United States has with our foreign partners, specifically the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. There's an excellent new book, hopefully you can see it, The Secret History of the Five Eyes. I think it's a fascinating book with some great stories. So I highly recommend the book, and I certainly have talked to our staff about selling it in our retail store. So that's an awful lot, Rollie. People want to hear from you, so I'm going to kick it over to you, Rollie.
Thank you, Chris. And what a fantastic roundup of some recent stories, including some that I think got lost that people haven't seen. I might make a couple comments on the dirty bomb story. I think it's worth noting that Ukraine invited the head of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Association. I never use the full thing, IAEA, over to inspect. And they were just there last month and found nothing inconsistent with what Ukraine had reported in its defense facilities. So at this point, no evidence of that. I don't know personally, but it seems like this is just another attempt by Russia to sort of skew the conversation and perhaps set up for their own nefarious activities. The other thing I would comment on, interesting that all three of the major spy chiefs in the UK have commented on the war in Ukraine and other matters in a country where that has not been traditional, and in some cases didn't even admit the existence of these agencies in the past. So quite a change. I think we've seen that in our own country too. And I think with the selective release of intelligence, just particularly prior to the start of Russian hostilities in Ukraine, but periodically throughout this engagement, that's something that didn't used to happen. And I can remember one or two instances in the past when it did, when, for instance, President Reagan in the 80s, in the wake of the Berlin disco bombing, released information from intercepts showing that there had been communications between the Libyan embassy in Germany, and Tripoli acknowledging responsibility for that bombing. And so this doesn't typically happen. And I think more and more we're seeing it happen, where we're in a way weaponizing intelligence in a way to drive events and the conversation. Finally, the last thing I'd like to say, I couldn't agree with Chris more on his comments on Bill Richardson. I can certainly understand, having been in the government for 30 years, how our policymakers and those working these situations, such as the Brittany Griner situation and hostages that have been taken, where they want to sort of control the conversation with the host government, and having a third party weigh in complicates things. But I'm all for it with Chris. If it does the trick and gets these hostages released and back home safe, I'm all behind Bill Richardson on that. So it's been an interesting month and an interesting year, in fact. And I think one of the quotes of the week for me was made by JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon on Tuesday in Saudi Arabia, when he said, geopolitics is what matters right now. He said, we can handle a recession. We know how to do that. But geopolitics is what I am most concerned about now. That direct quote from Jamie Dimon. Well, I think that's absolutely correct. We've had two cataclysmic events in the last few years. One, of course, was the pandemic, and now the Russian attack and a war they're waging in Ukraine, which have driven a lot of events and are going to have repercussions not only for the regions where these are happening, but around the world. And there are three major places I'm looking at right now, and it's no secret they are Russia's war in Ukraine, China, which had its Communist Party conference, and of course Iran, where we're seeing events that have never happened in the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran. So to start with China, or excuse me, I'll start with Russia, Ukraine. We all know Russia has not performed the way everyone expected them and the way they expected to. It's no accident, I think, that the three big countries I'm talking about are autocracies. And so we have seen Putin just make a lot of strategic and tactical errors in this war. But I think rather than talking specifically about the war itself, let's talk about the larger issues. And I think one of the important ones is hearts and minds. What's really going on in Russia? And it's very hard to know, of course. We get stories leaking out here and there about dissidents saying things or this and that, senior official being opposed to what Putin is up to. But it's hard to know, as it always is in an autocracy. Smart Russians don't talk. They know their heads get chopped off when they talk. So it's not like in the West where people have dinner parties and talk casually and freely about what they think about what the government is doing. It doesn't happen in Russia. There are indicators, though. When Putin announced the mobilization of 300,000 new recruits to go to the front, to go to the war in Ukraine, there was massive fleeing of Russia by young men not wanting to go to war. To me, that is a big signal that the hearts and minds, they don't want to fight this war. Certainly, we have also seen terrible morale among the troops in the field fighting this war, and of course, the surprisingly competent response of the Ukrainians, who have surprised at every turn, I think, just as much as the Russians, being as bad as they have been, as incompetent as they have been. The Ukrainians, on the contrary, have surprised us with how innovative they've been, how resourceful, and how successful. Which leads me to the larger issue of whether Vladimir Putin? I think we're all asking this question and nobody knows the answer. However, from most of my 30 years in the government and the CIA were spent either inside countries that were run by autocrats or handling issues back in Washington that concerned autocracies. And the one thing that has always struck with me is that dictators rule with the consent of the governed. Not everyone, but there's an implicit social contract between the people and that circle, that cabal around a dictator, that as long as the dictator continues to deliver a better standard of living, better education, better roads, less crime, and generally most of the society fares better, including that little circle around the dictator can usually survive. People will put up with a little less freedom of speech or a lot less freedom of speech if their standard of living continues to be good and get better. And Putin, I think, has broken that social contract. And we're starting now, just starting now to hear the rumblings of unhappiness. And I think, you know, I'm not going to make any predictions, but I would not be surprised if Putin is gone within 2 years. I'll go out on a limb with that. but I'll caveat that with I could be wrong. Turning to the other major autocracy in the world, China. We saw the Communist Party meetings this week, and Xi Jinping seems to have done what everybody expected him to do, which is consolidate his power. I don't think any of us quite expected to see the spectacle of Hu Jintao escorted out of the meeting hall. Anybody who believes that was about a medical issue, which is what the official party line was that came out of that meeting, I don't believe it. Those kinds of meetings are stage managed, choreographed down to the smallest detail. And I think it was no accident that Hu Jintao happened to be sitting next to Xi Jinping and that he was escorted out. That was a symbolic elimination of the last leader of China and the consolidation of Xi Jinping's power. And I think what we can see now is a full-blown autocracy, and even more dangerous, the elimination of criticism. We saw with the symbolic elimination of Hu Jintao, there was not a person in that room who did not understand explicitly and implicitly that dissent will not be tolerated. Xi Jinping then went on to excoriate the last government without mentioning Hu Jintao by name. But I think this is worrisome for the future of China, in that when dissent, as we've seen in Russia, when dissent is not allowed, mistakes get made. People are scared to tell the dictator the truth. So I think this is a worrisome development in China. I do think the economic numbers aren't as good as they used to be in China, and Xi Jinping's goal to have China join the category of wealthy nations is potentially at risk, not just economically, but in a system where no dissent is allowed and where all the power is vested in the top leader. Finally, I'd like to turn to Iran, another country where we have seen tectonic shifts, not only for the region, that have implications not only for the region, but for the world. This is the first time since the rise of the Islamic Republic of Iran that we have seen widespread dissent. And importantly, it's got the support of 50% of the population. And I'm talking about the women of Iran. this is particularly difficult for an autocratic ruler. It is it's never easy to send security troops out to police and use fierce tactics against men. It's really bad. The optics are just not good when you have to go out and police women in the streets. And as you all know, the incident that triggered this 40 days ago was the death of a young woman who was, while she was in custody, because she was wearing her hijab incorrectly. People are now, and these protesters are openly calling for the end to the Islamic Republic. This simply would not have been tolerated at all in the past. And I do think, again, autocracies, as I mentioned before, you never know, but they can survive a lot. But this is a major blow to the leadership and the supreme leader of Iran. The other thing that I think is really important, and in Iran, should there actually be a lessening or some kind of a reduction in the Islamic Republic status and a realignment of that regime, it of course has implications for the region. Iran has really been sort of the point around which people have either sided with Iraq, the countries in the region, or not. You've had for at least the last decade and longer, you've had Saudi Arabia, Israel, the UAE, and others, and most of the West in the anti-Iranian coalition. And if the Islamic Republic falls, it's an unknown how the region will realign. So I think a potential major implication coming out. Finally, since I'm told I'm invited to make a book recommendation, I would like to recommend this book, Chip War by Chris Miller. It got a great review last week in the New York Times, and it's a history of the rise of the semiconductor. And Chris Miller is the program director of Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI's Eurasia program. He's a remarkable author, historian, economist, and storyteller. This reads as fast as any fiction you'll ever read, and certainly the timing couldn't be better. And speaking of China and Taiwan, most of the world's most sophisticated semiconductors are manufactured in Taiwan, not China. China manufactures the semiconductors that are found maybe in your toaster, not the sophisticated chips that Taiwan produces. So this, it's a great book. The semiconductor industry has implications for the global economy. We've seen it at home in supply shortages. And one of the remarkable things, there isn't a shortage of supply of semiconductor chips. That's one of the things, when you read this, you'll begin to understand. It's not that there's a shortage because there was a stoppage in production. There's a shortage because the demand has increased so much. So one of the interesting little factoids I learned from Chris Miller in this book. It's a great read and a great story. So without further ado, I will pass the reins back to Chris. You're mute.
Thank you very much for that brilliant analysis. That was right on the mark from my point of view, and the excellent book recommendation. Of course, that's a different Chris Miller from one of our Spy Chat guests, but I'm very much looking forward to diving into that book, particularly, as you say, it's a very, very relevant topic right now. So Amanda, I think we are ready to take questions from our guests. I'm very excited about that.
Chris, I'm so excited that you made that distinction between the two Chris Millers. We have a great array of questions, and they focus on different areas, but I will So I will lump them together, and we're going to, of course, focus on Russia and Ukraine a little bit, but don't worry, there are other topics we will talk about. This one came in early, quite a great question. There is talk that US aid to Ukraine may be reduced or end. What are the possible ramifications of this, given the instability in so much of the world today? Little question.
You want me to take that one?
Yeah, go ahead, Rollie. I'll follow up.
Oh, okay. Well, it's interesting, but we have seen both extremes of both parties talking about ending aid to Ukraine. So this is sort of I could say it's a bipartisan issue on the extremes of both parties. Interesting that you focus on USAID, because I would say the larger concern for the alliance is what happens in Europe, because Europe, if they don't freeze this year, they're definitely going to freeze a year from now. As the European population, potentially tires of this war and the hardships they're enduring, I think the alliance and NATO's cohesiveness is potentially going to be put at risk. In the United States, we aren't suffering or going to suffer nearly as much, and it's more, I think, a question of where the U.S. should put its money. Where should we spend our budget? Where should it be?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that there could be some decrements. Some of this is going to be political here in the United States, but I couldn't agree more with the idea that the test is going to be Europe. How are they going to get through this winter with rising energy costs and some, frankly, authoritarian leaders in some parties in Western European countries that are talking about Putin in glowing terms? These are people that aren't not in place, but are competing in the body politic of different Western European countries. So this is going to play out over time. Interestingly, I watched an excellent interview with CNN's Wolf Blitzer talking to the Israeli president, I believe, challenging him. Is Israel going to provide more support to the Ukraine? So there are many countries that are going to have to serve their domestic constituencies first. But I think it is possible that over time, there will be some decrement of resources. But I think the West is committed to countering a malign Russia because of the risks that are at stake, particularly with the threat of some kind of nuclear conflagration, or at least using tactical nuclear weapons. The fact that we're even talking about this is quite mind-numbing. So I think that the countries that are committing to support Ukraine are going to continue to support Ukraine. But maybe because of a time of scarce resources, some of those resources will be pulled back. Really, it remains to be seen. But excellent question, though.
So we spoke a little bit about dirty bombs earlier, but do you think this guest wants to know if you think it's possible that Putin would stage a dirty bomb attack on Russian territories and blame it on Ukraine, citing the tactic used on Chechnya?
I can jump in there and field this question, and I know Rollie has an opinion, and she was exactly right. Because of that threat, the International Atomic Energy Agency has sent officials to Ukraine to look at literally where there's been mining for components that go into a nuclear bomb, such as uranium, just looking at those respective stores to certify that Ukraine is not pooling together to build a radiological device. This is right out of the Putin disinformation playbook. But it's being called out by Western intelligence. That intelligence is being revealed. So it's not a surprise that this is a possible pretext. And it might be executed on Ukraine's terrain, or it might be executed in Russia. But at the end of the day, it is a plan that Russia is conceiving potentially as a pretext to use maybe tactical nuclear weapons, or set aside tactical nuclear weapons, just a gross escalation of attacks against the civilian population in Ukraine. So it is entirely possible that that this threat is implemented. I'm sad to say.
I agree with Chris. I wouldn't put anything past the Russians, and whether they actually do it or they say it was done and stage it. The other aspect of this, though, if they were actually going to do this, either, make it look like the Ukrainians did it or launch a nuclear attack, I'm told, and I don't know if this is true, but I'm citing it because I've heard it, that it probably takes about 1,000 people knowing that they're going to do a nuclear attack for them to do a nuclear attack. And even if it's a fraction of that, if you have that many people who are in some way going to touch an operation like that, the chances of them doing it in secrecy, especially at a time when morale is bad, I think is nil. I think there's a pretty good chance that at a minimum, our intelligence community would have an early indication of a nuclear attack of any sort underfoot. And I'm guessing, from what I know, that is one of their highest priority collection targets. So I suspect they're watching that very closely. So I find it hard to believe that Russia would actually do it. I find it completely plausible that they'd say they did it, or say that the Ukrainians did this and then stage something. But the fact of them really doing it, I think I won't say no, because they're capable of all sorts of folly, but I think not.
Well, that is a very comforting answer. So I appreciate that. That leads us to people are wondering about, with Russia's apparently not that great mustering of troops and morale being down, what are the implications for future foreign policy, that maybe this is not the great bear, the great savage, strong bear? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I would just offer that we, the United States, and intelligence officers that studied the Soviet Union and then the successor state, Russia, we had a tendency historically to paint the Soviets as being 10 feet tall, and then the Russians. They are extremely lethal, but I think there's no illusions. The community probably assesses Russia as dangerous because they're unpredictable, but on a battlefield, person for person, man for man, soldier for soldier, and of course, there are a lot of women that are fighting in the Ukraine against Russia. Pound for pound, they are a weak force. But at the same time, they still pose a lethal threat to the United States.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the fact that this is an autocracy and people are scared to report bad news to the leadership is, I think, really weakens their military capabilities and the ability to, as we do in the United States, if there's an incident or something goes wrong in our own military, we're really very open about investigating it and finding out what went wrong and reporting truthfully to the leadership. That doesn't happen in Russia. And we've all talked about the fact that they don't have a non-commissioner officers corps, which I think is critical. It's one of the reasons I think our own military is so effective, that the commands don't necessarily have to come from the generals. There's a non-commissioned officer on the ground who generally knows way more than the generals know about the realities. I could extrapolate to say, I think this is also, we can perhaps make the leap that China's military also isn't 10 feet tall because it's modeled after the old Soviet and the Russian system. They don't have a non-commissioned officer corps either. They've got, I think, some of the same issues. And as I mentioned before, with Xi Jinping consolidating his power and indicating he will not tolerate any kind of dissent or candor, I think we could see the same thing going on in a place like China.
If I could just follow up, there was one story I didn't talk about explicitly that I will reference now. And it's a story in the Washington Post that said that the president's daily brief, President Biden's daily brief, identified an individual by name that was not revealed in the Washington Post article, an individual part of Putin's inner circle that had a significant disagreement with the prosecution of the war. Now, I was disturbed, although being a student of national security, I like everything I can read on national security issues. But at the same time, I was disturbed that an item that made the president's daily brief was leaked to the press, or it found its way to a journalist. All of that said, if true, this also is a harbinger of things to come. The fact that not only are people on the streets deeply, deeply concerned with Russia and the morale of Russian soldiers, it's been widely reported, is extremely low. When insiders start expressing it and it makes the president's daily brief, that is another indicator that the war is not going well.
Yeah, I think there also, I would note the sloppiness of their OPSEC. The fact that, you know, they're talking openly on email and in social media about, you know, the morale and how they don't like the war. This, you know, this does not bode well for Russia. Yeah.
All right, so just a couple more on Russia, and then I promise we will switch to other topics for those who are patiently waiting for their questions to be asked. The question about the Wagner Group, the private military organization in Russia, what kind of impact or influence do you think they might have on the successor to Putin, if Putin will really have a successor?
Well,
You want to take that
that's a
one?
tough question. I don't have any deep insights on that. I would offer this. Wagner Group is a proxy organization. It's a private army. They're operating in Africa, they're operating in Syria, and they're a problem because they're a proxy force that has some capabilities, but at the same time, they're committing civilian atrocities. I believe it's been documented in Mali as the French pulled out with the Malian government. The vacuum was filled by the Wagner Group. They're a problem, but at the same time, for any future leader of Russia, if he's of the same ilk whatsoever as Putin, the Wagner Group gives you the state some capability. So whoever takes over may want to cultivate that model or something like the Wagner Group or the Wagner Group in particular. They might turn out to be some kind of Praetorian Guard for successive leaders. I don't know. That's purely speculation, but I would be, again, it's hard to put yourself in Putin's mindset right now, or a successor of Putin. But I would suspect that the Wagner Group has some value to whoever comes after Putin. But that's purely conjecture. That's an educated guess on my part.
I would agree with your educated guess. And it would be an educated guess for me too. I do not know. The Wagner Group has been very useful though to Putin, and it's a classic covert action, or in their case, active measures capability, because there's plausible deniability, even though I think they're pretty much paid for by the Russian treasury. Everything they do gets paid for by the Russian government or the Russian Ministry of Defense. They still have plausible deniability because they are a private company, or at least they claim they are. And so I would think the Wagner Group will survive beyond Putin.
All right, we have a number of people interested in North Korea's nuclear saber rattling. And your thoughts, are they doing this while everyone's distracted? What's the long-term implication?
You've got that
Can
one,
you
Raleigh.
calm me down?
I've got this one. Okay.
Raleigh, can you calm me down again like you just did with Russia and nuclear weapons?
Well, I think the best thing I can say to try to calm you down is that Kim Jong-un isn't crazy. You know, he's not a madman, but he sees the world differently because his coin of vantage is different. And I think he will continue periodically to do this saber rattling. And perhaps the fact that the world's distracted has enabled him a little breathing room to play a little bit more, but I don't know that. I certainly have no intelligence to, that could shed any light on his particular motivations in this. But I think it's just, once again, when he misbehaves, the tendency, and I think his hope, is that, the West will somehow reward him to calm him down and put him back in the box again. And beyond that, I couldn't speculate.
And sort of another one about North Korea, but you may have a similar answer, Raleigh, which is, do you think he will escalate the situation with South Korea? Wow.
Well, it's one and the same sort of question. Yeah, I mean, South Korea is always he may shoot those missiles over Japan, but his real concern is South Korea. And again, this is the same thing he's been doing for however long he's been in power, and before that, his predecessors, his father and his grandfather. So I think we'll continue to see this kind of behavior regardless of whether the world is distracted or not.
You mentioned Japan, and one of our guests who's very interested in the book that you recommended, Chris, was wondering about the chance of Japan or other countries being allowed to become a member of Five Eyes.
Yeah, that's a superb question. I think the answer is yes. And I think explicitly National Security Advisor Sullivan, as I recall listening to and watching his Georgetown speech on the national security strategy, alluded to future partnerships. And I think I will massacre the acronyms, but there is a partnership that's brewing out of Asia among intelligence, non-traditional intelligence partners. I'm talking on a separate panel next week, and that's the case I'm going to make to the panel that I talked to. For what it's worth, my opinion is we should look at non-traditional partnerships. It's absolutely crucial that we expand intelligence partnerships to help counter these threats that Raleigh has talked about, because I didn't even talk about Iran and the fact that it looks like we're going to disengage a little bit from the Middle East. We need to rely on partners in place to counterbalance Iran. So it's a dangerous world. There are lots of threats, and we need to rely on special partnerships. And I'll give another example. Certainly in the Middle East, United Arab Emirates, they're not a part of the Five Eyes, nor is the state of Qatar, but they have helped in the region, and so hasn't Saudi Arabia in terms of counterterrorism. While they are not a part of a Five Eyes community, there is lots of there was historically lots of intelligence sharing, particularly on counterterrorism. So I think we're going to see increasingly an expansion of partnerships, but that's a lot for nations to work through. The details of those relationships, but I think they're important.
I would echo, I think alliances are absolutely critical. And I think alliances, even with countries whose systems we don't love, remain important because we still have mutual interests in things like counter-narcotics, counterterrorism, organized crime. And But I have to say, the Five Eyes itself, yeah, we have very close alliances with our NATO partners, with countries in the East, such as Japan, South Korea, other nations in Pacific and elsewhere in the world. However, I think there's something pretty sacred about the Five Eyes, and even more sacred about the latest alliance, AUKUS, Australia, the US, and the UK, who really are, I'm probably going to get hate mail for this, who are sort of the most robust part of the Five Eyes, the ones who bring the most resources, both intelligence and in terms of defense, to the table. And so I sort of think the Five Eyes will continue to exist. You can write me and yell at me when I'm proven wrong, but I do think there's something special with that particular alliance.
Well, this is a Five Eyes related question because one of our frequent guests who's waited patiently for this question to be asked wonders if there is enough Five Eyes and transatlantic NATO cooperation in raising risk awareness on Chinese and Russian infiltration of academia. That's just a little question.
That's a loaded question.
Would you like to take it, Chris?
I would just say that to underscore your point, although the Five Eyes relationship has been sacrosanct, and I too agree it's going to continue, that doesn't mean that NATO countries in particular aren't sharing information on Chinese and Russian threats. I mean, I worked as a counterintelligence agent a long time ago in the 1990s at, essentially, I was in a NATO billet, although there was US only information. At the same time, we shared an awful lot with our partners about mutual threats. So I have to believe, in fact, I'm confident that mutual threat information is shared.
I would echo that. I think absolutely. I mean, our alliance is well beyond the Five Eyes, for instance, in Southeast Asia, who, believe me, if you think we're concerned about China, those countries, they're our allies, they are also very concerned. So yes, we have alliances beyond the sort of traditional Five Eyes and NATO who we share information with.
Right, now we get to kind of the ping-ponging around questions, which I like. It's a grab bag, although not that this is jolly. Any comments on the international impact, if any, of the sudden passing of former Defense Secretary Ash Carter?
I would just like to say what a great gentleman. And I mean that in every sense of the word. He was a thinker, a great analyst, and a real gentleman. And he was also the recipient. Foreign Policy Research Institute gives out an annual Benjamin Franklin Award for someone who exemplifies a great statesman, scholar, or soldier. And he received it, I think it was 2015 when he was awarded that, the Benjamin Franklin Award. So, I mourn his untimely passing. He was a brilliant commentator and an analyst of the world, and I'm sorry to see his passing.
Well said, Rollie. I didn't have the privilege of interacting with the former secretary, but I too have heard that he was a gentleman, and he was a giant in terms of his impact on foreign policy and certainly defense matters. And we need to celebrate those leaders. Secretary Powell died just a few years ago. We just need to ensure that we pass the torch along, and it's the future generations. Some of those folks are probably listening to Spy Chat right now. I know we've got students on board. They can emulate leaders like Ash Carter and Secretary Colin Powell, for example.
Yeah.
Switching gears, who do you think sabotaged the Nord Stream pipelines? It was not me.
If I knew, I wouldn't be able to say.
Yeah, I mean, again, conjecture, don't have access to the intelligence. I think there was some reporting from the, if I'm not mistaken, out of Norway, suggesting that it was clear that Russia has their hands in it, but no way of knowing from this seat.
So hearkening back to the discussion of the dramatic imagery of the party Congress coming as such a surprise, should we take that as an indication that we do not presently really have much intelligence insight into the workings of the PRC leadership?
I think I would say it came as a surprise to we on the outside and the media. It would be hard for me. I couldn't even speculate whether the intelligence community had an indication this was going to happen. They might have. I don't know.
Yeah, I have nothing to add there, Amanda.
It's always a good reminder that as transparent as we are in this country about intelligence, we still are not. We have to remember, they cannot show us their hand and tell us everything they know. I forget that even after all these years talking about history, we still find things out that are surprising. So thank you for that reminder. And Rollie, because of your recommendation of the chip book, one guest wants to know is, do we have the semiconductor chip manufacturing capacity to replace the facilities in Taiwan?
Scary answer, absolutely not. It costs over $1 billion to build a semiconductor fabricating plant. And even though there are some efforts underway to do that, they're extremely costly and it takes a long time. And the plans, by the time you built it, the technology is obsolete. So you have to keep, as you're building it, updating your plans to make sure you're keeping up. I think this is if China takes out Taiwan Semiconductor Machinery Company, which produces, I don't know what it is, 40 or 50% of the world's most sophisticated semiconductor chips, we're all sunk if that happens anytime in the next 5 years, I think. I think China, personally, I think they'd be foolish to do it because they are one of the biggest customers of Taiwan Semiconductors. So I can hope that would be an effective deterrent. But no, we are nowhere near the United States replacing. We are most sophisticated industries buy their semiconductor chips from Taiwan.
Well, I told you we were finished with Ukraine, and this is a big question, but it came in rather late, and I think it is quite interesting. So let's slip this final one in, which is wondering about food exports from Ukraine and, the lack of those and the impact on those and the resulting global hunger and that impact on security. I don't know if you want to tackle that in 1 minute.
I think it's an impact. I think we've had global shocks, and I think we're going to see the repercussions around the world. And governments around the world have a witch's brew of catastrophes they're having to deal with: hunger, energy supplies, inflation, illness, contagion, the pandemic. And I think we're seeing instability in governments around the world. It's a terrible time to have to try to govern. And look at the UK, no further than our closest ally, and you see some governing issues, shall we say?
Yes.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Rollie more. I mean, these are certainly interesting times.
Well, they are so interesting that there was no way for us to get to all of our questions. But Chris, before I wrap this up, do you have anything final to say?
No, just as I expected, Rollie didn't disappoint. I'm so happy to see her, and really was very excited about Spy Chat today. And our audience questions, as usual, were were outstanding, and thank you for curating them so well, Amanda. I'm really looking forward to next month's Spy Chat, which I'm sure you're going to talk about with General Nagata. So really looking forward to that as well. So thanks, Rollie. Great seeing you. Thank you, team.
And thank you all. SPY is a great organization. I'm privileged to be a part of it.
Well, we really appreciate you, Rollie, and I want to thank all of our guests, because we really wouldn't even do. Why would we do this if you didn't write us these fabulous questions and give me a chance to challenge these great brains that are on the screen with me? Chris already mentioned that our SPY guest next month is pretty exciting, but I'm going to invite you to something that's happening a little before that. If you can get to DC, or if you're in DC, we are having our very exciting 16th annual Parade of Trabants. And that is a very fun free event around the Spy Museum. You can see a bunch of Cold War cars. This is the biggest rally of these cars in the country, and it's a hoot, and it's really, really fun. So if you'd like to brighten a cold November day, come on down to the museum and check our calendar for Parade of Trabants, for General Nagata's talk with Chris, and for other programs for people of all ages. And as always, donations, we do not turn them away. They certainly help us keep going, and they make us feel like what we're doing is important to you, because you all are important to us. So thanks, everyone.